Hello, what's going on? I'm Arunava and this video is about iterators in Python. So sit back and relax and let me tell you all you need to know about iterators in Python. Before diving in, I would like to mention a few of the prerequisites for this video. Firstly, I would assume that you are familiar with basic Python syntax and programming. Next, I would expect a little bit familiarity with classes in Python. Next, I'm expecting you have a general idea of what objects are. And lastly, a tad bit familiarity with exceptions will be helpful. But it's all quite intuitive. So even if it seems like something you're having a hard time to recall, stick around. I'm sure it will all make sense. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so let's take a quick overview of the topics that will be covered in this video. So we start off with what iterators are in Python and we get a clear understanding of how things are working out, and then we move on to using iterators with the built-in iterables, and then we mimic the inner workings of a for in loop, and then we build our own custom iterator in Python. How exciting is that? Okay, so let's get started. The big question for this video is, what are iterators? Now, before laying out a solid definition for what iterators are, let me highlight a few things. These are a few common terms. You all have worked with basic for loops. So this is called the iterator variable. And it is the one which takes on different values on each iteration. Okay. Next is the iterable, which is an object that can return an iterator. And it is the one which stores the values that the iteration variable takes on in each iteration. Now, how can an object qualify as an iterable? We'll come to that in a second. Okay. And lastly, this is a block of code that gets executed in each iteration. If I now try to paint a picture out of this, it would be like this. The iterator variable takes on different value one at a time on each iteration, and this value comes from the iterable, and for each iteration the code block gets executed. Now let's take a closer look at the iterable. Simply speaking, it is an object that can be used with a for in loop to iterate over all the elements stored inside that object. This point highlights something that we are already familiar with from the last slide. So all objects that can be used with a foreign are iterables. Now let's take a look at the second point. The second point says that a Python iterable object must implement two methods, iter and next. And note that these iter and next are followed with two underscores at the front and at the back. Okay, so in order to qualify as an iterable for Python, the iter and the next methods must be implemented. Now, let's take a closer look at what these two methods does in an iterable object. Now, these two methods are also collectively called the iterator protocol. Okay, the iter method simply returns an iterator object or the iterator, and this object, as we know by now, should have the next method implemented. This method must be called to get the iterator object from the iterable object. Okay, the next method is the one which simply returns the next value in the iterable. Next up, let's take a closer look into the next method. The next method, as we all know by now, returns the next item in the iterable. Let's take a look into the second point. It says it raises the stop iteration exception to signal the end of iteration. The third point ties the first and the second point together. It says in each iteration, the next method is called to get the next item in the sequence. And when the next raises the stop iteration exception, the iteration ends. So what this means is the next method is called to get the next value of the iterator object or the sequence. So when there is no more values left in the iterator object, then the next method raises the stop iteration exception, which indicates that there are no more values in the iterator object and that the iteration should now stop. Okay, that's all about special methods that needs to be implemented in order to make an iterator. Next up, we will see two useful functions and then start coding. All right. So Let's take a look at the iter and the next function. Note, this is not the underscore underscore iter function and the underscore underscore next function. So this iter and next is different from this iter and this next respectively. So from now on, I'm gonna go ahead and call this iter function as the non underscore iter function and this one as the non underscore next function. Similarly, I'm gonna go ahead and call this one the underscore iter function and this one the underscore next function. Okay. Now, iter takes an iterable and returns the iterator object, or simply speaking, the iterator, which can then be used to get the elements in the iterator one after the other using the next function. Okay. All right. You now know all you need to know about iterators. Okay. So here I've listed a few iterables built into Python. So namely, they are lists, sets, tuples, and dicts. In general, as I said, all objects that can be used with a for in loop are iterables, and they can be used with the iter function, the non underscore iter function, to get the iterator object, or simply speaking, the iterators. Exactly. So let's now dive into the code, and in the process we'll put everything together that we have learned so far. All right, let's now get into coding. Whoa, this will be exciting. Okay, let's first start by using iterators with the built-in iterables. Okay, so let's declare an iterable, and you saw that some of the built-in iterables are lists, sets, dicts, and tuples. Here I'm going to use a list. Okay, so iterable equals 1 2 2 3, 4 5 6 7. So here is an iterable. Okay, now remember, to make an iterable and iterator object, you need to use the iter function, that is the non underscore iter function, passing the iterable. Okay, so let's do that. Iter obj, and let's pass the iterable to the iter function. Okay, so now the iterator object is returned to the iter obj. So if I print iter obj, you can see that it's a iterator object. Okay, remember, we can use the next function, the one without the underscores, to get the next element from the iterable. Okay, so let's see it in action. Next, and if I pass the iterator object over here, so we'll get the next element. So the first element is printed. Okay, now let's see it in action again. Okay, so the next element is now printed. Now the non underscored next function calls the underscored next function of the iterator object internally to get the next item of the iterator object. So without using the non underscored iterator function, let's just try and use the underscored iterator function that is implemented in the iterator object. Okay, sorry, iter obj that. Okay, so this should return the next item in the iterator object. So let's see if it does so. Oh yeah, it does. It does return the next item in the iterator object. How cool. Okay, now if we keep playing around with the next function, then we will keep on printing the next items that is present inside the iterator variable. So let's just go ahead and keep printing out the next item in the iterator variable. So next is 4, the next one will be 5, the next one will be 6, and the last one will be 7. Now, as we said that as now the iterator object is exhausted, that is, there are no more values present inside the iterator object, so the iterator's next function should now raise a stop iteration exception. So if I now call the next of the iterator object, then it should raise a stop iteration exception. So let's see if it does so. And there you go, a stop iteration exception is now raised. Now don't forget that to iterate over an iterator, you just have to use the for loop like this. But before using a for loop, we need to declare an iterable, right? So let's just declare an iterable. 1 2 3 4 5 6. Okay, now if I use a for loop like this, and that is all that is needed to iterate over an iterable. Okay, so there you go, all the iterations done. All right, so I showed this example, that is the using of the non_iter function and the non_next function, as this is how it is internally achieved in the for in loop. Okay, so let's try and mimic the internal working of a for in loop with an iterator object. What say, huh? This will be exciting. Okay, let's do it. Okay, let's see behind the scenes of a for loop. Okay, so assuming you have familiarity with functions in Python, I'm going to create a function that will take an iterable and behave just as a for in loop. And for the body of the for in loop, we will just print the characters to keep this example simple. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, let's just call the function mimic foreign, and okay. Okay, and for the argument, I'm just going to take an iterable as the only argument, as that is all we need. Okay. First things first, let's go ahead and get the iterator object from the iterable using the iter function. Now let's start an infinite while loop to keep looping over the iterator again and again, and we're gonna break the while loop when the stop iteration exception is raised by the iterator. So let's start an infinite while loop here. Okay, so let's now start a try block, and inside it, okay, and inside it, let's put the body of the for loop that needs to get executed in each iteration. Okay, so this is the start of the for loop, and inside this should be the end of the for loop. Okay, yeah. Okay, so in this try block, we will call the next function of the iterator in each iteration. Okay, and I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to keep things simple and just to print the iterator variables, that is the values that is stored in the iterator, and you can play around on your own. Okay, so that would be, so over here we're gonna just print the variables, sorry, the values stored in the iterator. So I'm just going to call the next of the iter obj, right? Okay, so just to keep things simple, that's all that will be there inside the for body, and this then will demark the end of the loop. And therefore for each of the iteration, the next function would get called, and when the values in the iterator gets exhausted, the iterator is going to raise the stop iteration exception, and we're going to catch it in the except clause. So let's just catch the stop iteration exception. Okay, so when this exception is caught, it would mean the values in the iterator are exhausted and we need to break out. So let's just say that break. Okay, so there you have, it's the inner working of our for in loop. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and save this. Okay, so just going to call it something 1.py. okay, and there you go, syntax highlighted. So this function mimics the inner working of a for in loop. What we need to do now is to declare an iterable. Let's say it's a list again, and okay, let's just keep things okay, 23, 56, 67. Okay, so there is an iterable, and what we need to do now is we need to call the mimic foreign with the iterable, passing the iterable. Okay, so just gonna go ahead and call mimic foreign with the iterable. Okay, I'm just gonna save it. Okay, and let's just run this. There you go, first one printed, so that's the first item, then two, then two again, two again, and then 34, 56, 23, 56, 67. One by one they all get printed, and when the stop iteration exception is raised, we break out of the loop. As you can see, it's successfully finished. So congratulations, you just mimicked the working of a for in loop. Okay, finally, let's see how you can go about building your own custom iterator in Python. Woohoo! This would be too much fun. Before getting started, let me just mention what type of iterator we would be building. So I'm gonna make an iterator which return 1 once in the first iteration, 2 once in the second iteration, 3 once in the third iteration, and so on. Okay, let's get started. I'm gonna go ahead and call this iterator the custom iterator. So custom iterator. All right. Okay. Let's start by declaring the constructor. So there you have it. Okay. Now I'm going to pass the self, and for the first argument I'm going to take in an argument called mx, and this argument defines the maximum number of ones that will get printed. That is the number of ones that will get printed in the last iteration of this iterator. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and give it a default value of 10. And now let's set the mx variable of this object as the mx that gets passed when we create an instance of this object. Okay, now remember, for an object to qualify as an iterator, we must implement the two special methods inside the object. One is the underscore iter and the underscore next. Okay, so let's start by implementing first the iter function. Okay, here let's start by setting the mn variable of this object as to 1, and this would indicate that on the first iteration we're going to print 1 once in the 1 once. Okay, all right. And do you remember what we need to do in the iter function? Exactly, we need to return the iterator object. So to return the iterator object, all we need to do is to return a reference to self, and this would do the job. Okay, finally let's implement the next function. All right. Okay, so on each iteration, the first thing we need to check is if mn, the attribute which indicates the number of ones that will get printed in the current iteration, has exceeded the max number that is allowed to be printed, the max number of ones that is allowed to be printed, and which is indicated by the mx variable that we declared in the constructor. Okay, so let's just go ahead and first check that. So if self dot mn is greater than self dot mx, then we need to break. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that is less than self dot mx, and then we can do all the essentials over here, and we can keep the breaking part in the else statement. Okay, so inside this if statement, what we need to do is we need to return actually the next value for this iterator object. And if you remember, we're going to print the goal of this iterator object is to print 1 once in the first iteration, 2 once in the next iteration, and the iteration and the number of ones that should get printed is indicated by the mn variable. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and do something like this. S is equals to mn into, okay, so what this does is it creates once mn number of times. So mn number of times one gets created and it gets stored in the s. So all we need to do now is to return the s. Okay, so return s, but aren't we forgetting something? Exactly, we need to increase mn, otherwise it will be an infinite loop. Okay, so before returning mn s, we need to increase mn by 1. Okay, and if you have not already noticed, this should be self.mn. Okay, now if this check fails, it would mean that mn is greater than mx, which indicates the iteration should now be stopped. And for that we need to raise, yes, the stop iteration exception. So let's just go ahead and raise the stop iteration exception. Okay, so that would do it. So that is all that's needed for the custom iterator. Now we're going to go ahead and test it. To test it, what I'm going to do is we're going to create an instance of this custom iterator, and we're going to pass 12. What this would mean is this mx variable is now containing 12, and so as soon as there is an iteration which prints 12 once, then we will raise the stop iteration as mn will exceed mx, and that will indicate the end of the loop. Okay, and since temp is an iterable, we can just put this inside a foreign loop and test it. So let's do that. For I in temp, to keep things simple, I'm just going to go ahead and just print it. Okay, so let's now execute, and there you go. So 1 gets printed in the first iteration, 2 1s gets printed in the second, 3 1s in the third, 4 1s in the fourth iteration, 5 1s in the next, and so on until there's 12. The 12 1s get printed in the last iteration. Okay, so there you go. You have it, your first custom iterator. Okay, congratulations. Okay, well done. Now, to summarize what we have learned so far, and for the big question, what are iterators, here's what we can say about it. An object which implements the underscored iter and the underscored next methods is called an iterable. And this iterable can be used to create an iterator object that will return one element at one time using the next function, the non-underscored next function. And when there is no more data or no more values, that is, the iterator object gets exhausted, the iterator, the next function of the iterator, raises the stop iteration exception to signal the end of iteration. All right, now go implement your own iterators and play around with the code. Practice more and more. Always remember, practice makes you perfect. All right, thanks for watching the video. Do like and share if you like this video, and subscribe. Okay, bye bye. Take care.